Hello, my name's Erica Thompson. I've been machine knitting for over 40 years and using wire on my knitting machine for more than 20. I use a Brother 710 knitting machine to knit with wire, but any standard gauge metal bed machine can be used. When I first began experimenting, I had to work out what sort of wire would be suitable for knitting on the machine. I first tried a very fine wire. This is 0.08 of a millimetre and actually far too fine, as it just kept breaking. Next I tried a much thicker wire, 0.335 of a millimetre. However, this was too thick and the machine just couldn't cope. An in-between size, 0.2 millimetre, and this worked. However, it wasn't quite what I was looking for. I realised I could use more than one strand, as I would had I been knitting with yarn. This was a bowl that I made using 2 strands, quite nice and delicate and yet a little flimsy. 4 strands together, and this was what I was looking for. This is much more weighty and the knitting can be manipulated and it stays put. It's quite tactile. A nice little pot. Another wire that was available at the time was a plastic coated silver plated copper. This looked much thicker and yet it was much softer, so the wire inside is 0.25 millimetre, only slightly thicker than the 0.2, and yet it behaved much more like using a 4-ply yarn. Most of my wire knitting is done with stitch size 6 or 7. I really wanted to be making wire jewellery. That was my aim at the time, and after many experiments on the machine I designed 5 different styles of earring. Here are the designs that I made at the time. Of course, these are just a starting point for your own experiments. In these we have stitch transfers to make lace holes, increasing and decreasing, latching up ladders, and cables. This one below is just a variation of this one. I didn't actually read my own pattern properly and I cabled every other stitch instead of cabling just the first 2 and then transferring to make the holes, but I liked the end result, so I kept it. I'll come back to these later. First I'm going to show you something much more simple. I wanted to be able to knit other jewellery items as well as earrings on the machine, and in order to knit necklaces or bracelets I thought the easiest way would be to knit a strip. But knitting a strip on the machine produces something which is quite stiff and not really what I was looking for. This little necklace has beads added to it later. I'll show you some close-ups at the end. So knitting with 3 stitches produces quite a stiff little strip, and as I said, this is not what I was looking for. What I wanted was something a lot more fluid, like this. It can be bent and twisted and shaped. I had a eureka moment. We've all knitted idiot cord, sometimes called I-cords, on the knitting machine with yarn. This is where you set the machine to knit in one direction and slip the other direction. So the end of the strand at one end of the row is carried across the back of the knitting to the start of the next row. When knitted in yarn, this long strand is redistributed amongst the other stitches, and so a round tube results quite quickly. However, the same stitch knitted in wire produces something completely different. It stays flat as a strip, and the strand lying across the back becomes a curved loop. The end of this loop joins with the other loops at the end of the knitting and behaves in exactly the same way as chainmail. Now, we know that chainmail was designed to move over the body, and so this was exactly what I was looking for. The strip was slightly narrower than plain knitting. That was easily solved by adding on another stitch. And so here we have 4 stitches. The wire is now available in over 30 colours. So I'm going to choose 4 bright colours and show you how to set those up on the machine. The wire comes with sticky labels. These must be removed before you knit on the machine. So I'm threading these onto a horizontal knitting needle held in place on 2 cones of yarn. Just make sure that the knitting needle is horizontal. Before knitting with wire on the knitting machine, you must use waste yarn to start off with. Make sure that you cast on where the row counter tripper will trip, because you're only going to work with 3 needles. Just do a simple cast on with waste yarn. And hang a weight. Take the 4 ends of wire and very carefully, and with a lot of respect for the wire, take them up through the tension mast as usual. Thread into the carriage and set the row counter to count. For one of these strips for a bracelet, I'll knit 300 rows. Press in 1 part button. In this case, I'm pressing the right part button, so the carriage will knit in that direction and slip coming back this way. Set the row counter to 0 and the row counter tripper to trip, and for a bracelet I'll knit 300 rows. So there's 40 rows already. Did you expect it to be that easy? So we have just 10 rows left to knit. going to cut the wire and cast off. Three stitches onto one needle and pull the end through. Take the other end with the waste yarn, replace onto the machine after cutting off the waste yarn. One of the advantages of knitting with wire is that it doesn't unravel. Two stitches onto one needle and pull that end through as well. So there we have a strip. Usually what I do is add that to my collection of knitted strips, and I'll show you how to turn that into jewellery. Here's a selection of bracelets that I've made. You can see lots of different patterns, different widths of bracelets, narrow, medium and wide. And this is the pattern book that goes with it. It explains everything you need to know, lots of hints and tips for knitting with wire. It explains the quantities that you might need for each of the pieces. It includes patterns for earrings to go with. And on the back we have 9 different braiding patterns, which I'm going to show you later. I've now set the knitting machine up with the plastic coated wire. I'm using white so it should be quite easy to see the stitches. I'm going to knit one of these small lacy earrings. I've already cast on with waste yarn, 3 needles again. I'm going to use stitch size 7 and my row counter is on 0. First of all, cast on with E-wrap, leaving a tail. And knit 1 row. Increase 1 stitch on the right. Pull all the needles out to holding position and knit 2 rows. And repeat. Increase 1 stitch on the right, pull all the needles to holding position and knit 2 rows. Again, increase 1 stitch, pull all needles out to holding position and knit 2 rows. The reason I pull the needles out to holding position every row is just simply to ensure that they're knit correctly, and the earring is very small so it really doesn't add much time. Now I have increased and I'm on row counter 7. I now need to start decreasing on the opposite side every 2 rows. I'm going to carry on the increasing until I have 7 holes. stitch didn't quite knit properly, so I'm just going to knit that through, make sure that's properly knitted. So I've now got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is my 6th hole. And now I'm going to start decreasing on every row to bring the needles, the earring in at the top edge. As you can see, the earring is knitted on the bias, so I need to move my claw weight up to centralise the weight. This is my last hole. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And continue decreasing on every row as before. Again, just need to help that knit through. Now I'm up to row counter 15. I'm going to decrease on both sides. Two onto one needle, knit 2 rows, cut the wire off and remove from the machine. There we have the earring. So you can see I've now knitted the second earring, reversing right for left in the instructions. You can, if you like, make 2 identical, it's up to you. What I'm now going to do is tidy it up a little. I'm using a cable needle for this, and what I'm going to do is just make these holes identical and much more round. Now I'm going to use this tool, which is supplied with knitting machines. It has a pointy end, and I'm just going to use that to bring out these lace loops along the edge. Now I would manipulate the earring into a pleasing curved shape, and all that remains for me to do now is to stitch this tail along this edge up to the top of the earring. So there we have a pair of earrings, the top edge here, and so on the jump ring and the earring hook. Here we have another style of earring, and again I'm going to do the final shaping on here. I can bring out the edge loops as before, graduating them up to the top of the earring. But also in this case, I'm using, in this case, a knitting machine tool because it happens to be handy, and just winding the earring around to create a spiral shape. Incidentally, that second earring took me only 2 minutes and 18 seconds to knit. And here we have the long strip that we knitted earlier, which incidentally took 3 minutes to knit. So I'm now going to make this into a small bracelet. First of all, find the halfway point. And now I'm just simply going to twist one side over the other. I'll do a little bit and then I'll show you what it looks like. I need to have a firm grip on this so that it holds itself in place. It's quite easy to do. Now the 300 rows that I knitted will produce a bracelet that will fit an average size wrist. You can make it longer or shorter as you wish. Try to make sure that the two ends up balance. Nearly there. And there's our bracelet. What I'll now do is thread the two wires through a needle and stitch the starting end over the tail. And of course, when you're stitching, make sure that you bring the tails up to the outside surface so they don't scratch your wrist. Now you remember the braiding patterns I showed you earlier. If you make two strips, what you can then do is braid them together to create a new pattern. I managed to find 9 different patterns, but I'm sure there are more. So I'm just going under and over from one side and over from the other side. Under and over, just like plaiting hair. And again, try and end up with all 4 tails at the same point. You can see the bracelet there with its diagonal stripe. This is braid number 2 on the pattern. Another example is this one. This produces a chevron pattern. This time over 1 and over 2. Over 1 and over 2. Over 1 and over 2. And there's our pattern. Here's another example of a finished bracelet. This time there's an extra little twiddly bit in the middle and one colour down one side, another colour on the other side. If you end up with all 4 tails exactly the right length, you can then stitch the findings on to turn it into a little bracelet, and then you get a very neat join. If, however, things don't quite work out that well, perhaps the bracelet's a little bit too long or too short, what you can then do is cut off the end with a pair of scissors and put on one of these ribbon end clasps. It works rather like a little book covering the end of the wire, and then you can add your finding on to turn it into a bracelet. And this is a good opportunity if you need it slightly longer or slightly shorter. In that pattern I mentioned there are also some earrings. Here's one set. And another set. And this is a variation which is actually a combination of the 2 others together. You can have lots of fun combining colours of wire, which do blend together like paint, yet on closer inspection they marble together, maintaining the original colours. I love to make jewellery to match my outfits. Here we have a bracelet, a necklace and earrings to match this little lacy top. The combined weight of this jewellery set is about 30 grams. When you think there's 50 grams of wire on one reel, a little goes a long way. Here is another of my tops, and this is the necklace that I made to go with it. I'll be showing you how to do this in just a few moments. And if you don't have the right colour of wire to match your outfit, you can use sewing thread. This is an embroidery silk in turquoises and greens and purples. Using that in combination with the champagne coloured wire produces a lovely variegated effect. This time I've mixed the plastic black wire with a variegated sewing cotton. This time the same black plastic wire was mixed with a shiny embroidery thread. And of course you can mix the wire with yarn. So the fine yarns used to make this Fair Isle waistcoat, I mixed black wire with the black yarn and a silver wire with the speckly yarn. And here's the resulting bracelet. An interesting way to blend the colours of wire. Take a selection of colours and put them in an order, and then use these four together, then these four together, and then these four together, and then these four together. And all four strips will blend together and work well. Here I've chosen four unlikely colours to put together, and yet here is the strip that results. A rather random but beautiful combination. Reminds me of the rainbow effect on the top of puddles. Choose any four colours and get a lovely surprise. One day I knitted a strip, and then for some reason I decided to see what would happen if I pulled it. Of course it went a little narrower, but I could see that it was also becoming rounder in cross section. So I thought if I pushed this through a hole and forced it into a round shape, that it would change completely. I made myself a little drawer plate, different sizes of holes. So feeding through the first hole forces it into a round shape. Through the second hole makes it a little bit smaller. Third hole a little bit smaller again. And so on until you decide you have the right size. Now this looked completely different, and a whole new world opened up. Here is a selection of these strips. So what I then went on to produce was Scrumple knit. So this is 4 different strips randomly scrunched together, and produced a little necklace. Here's another one, not quite so scrunched up. And here's the pattern for that. Also in the pattern I've included some earrings, which I called scribble earrings. The hardest part of these is making 2 that look slightly similar. If you find that too hard, what you can do is just turn them into pendants. Here's one. And another. And you can have great fun making these. And yes, these beads in these necklaces are knitted on the knitting machine. Knitting in the loosest sense. The necklace is included in my latest pattern, organic and 3D knitted wire jewellery. Also included in the pattern are these little hearts. These can be used as earrings or card decorations. And for the knitter who is a little bit more experienced in knitting with wire, here is a set knitted in Fair Isle. The earrings start off as a square. This is then manipulated into this shape. Pull into a lozenge shape, squeeze the top, finger underneath, push it into a 3D shape and bend the corner up. And there we have the earrings. These little bubble shape earrings are also made from a square. Here's the knitted square of wire, 12 stitches by 15 rows. Cast off the edges and manipulate the square to exaggerate the corners. Curve the edges in. I'm using a little bead in the centre to help me get the round shape, and I can now pull all 4 corners up to the top. Take the bead out and just use a pencil into the holes to create this shape. Everything I've shown so far is included in my patterns, and all of these are on my website, along with the wire and the findings to turn your creations into jewellery. I continue to experiment with wire, often combining with knotting and beading and twisting and braiding. These are my latest creation. Another pair of earrings. In this video I focused on making wire jewellery because it's quick and easy and fun to make, and you end up with something to wear rather than just another practice piece. If jewellery is not your thing, you can give us a present, light and easy to post and something very different. You can use the most basic of knitting machines And if you don't already have one, you'll find that you can pick one up second hand very easily these days, often just for the asking. People often ask if the wire damages the machine in any way, but I can honestly say I've never had any problems. Both types of wire can be hand knitted or crocheted, but please do experiment with the types, the thicknesses and the numbers of strands that you use until you find the optimum combination that works best for you. I hope I've inspired and even tempted you to have a go knitting with wire on your knitting machines. Thanks for watching.